My name is Helen Cooper. I'm 62 years old. A retired nurse who spent most of her life taking care of other people's patients, neighbors, and most of all, my son, Ryan. These days my world is small and quiet, the smell of coffee in the kitchen every morning, the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, the soft hum of the refrigerator. I thought I had earned this peace after so many years of work and sacrifice, but peace can disappear in a single sentence. That afternoon, Ryan sat across from me at my own kitchen table, his hand wrapped around a coffee mug, like he belonged there, and told me that from now on, he'd be transferring all of my paychecks into his account. He said it would be easier for everyone for my own good. Those were his exact words. At first, I didn't even process what he was saying. I just stared at him, trying to find the boy I once cradled, the boy I had worked double shifts to raise. But all I saw was a calm, confident man who already believed he was in control. I didn't argue. My voice barely made a sound as I told him I trusted him. But inside, something tightened. It wasn't agreement, it was awareness. I wanted to see how far he would go, what this new version of my son was really capable of. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the same place where everything had changed, and made a quiet promise to myself I would play along, but I would watch him closely. When I think back to those years, it feels like watching someone else's life through a fogged window, blurry, endless, but somehow still warm. Ryan was only 2 when his father left. I remember standing in the doorway, holding my son on my hip, pretending I wasn't afraid, pretending I knew how to start over. Those first few years were a blur of movement. I worked double shifts at the hospital, sometimes coming home when the sun was already rising. My hands smelled like disinfectant and coffee, my body carried the ache of exhaustion I couldn't shake off. But the moment I heard Ryan's little footsteps running down the hallway, all that pain faded. I'd scoop him up, bury my face in his hair, and breathe him in. He smelled like milk and crayons and safety. There were nights I didn't sleep at all. After he fell asleep, I'd clean other people's houses for extra money. I used to whisper to myself that it was temporary, that one day, I'd be able to give him everything I never had. Every dollar I earned went into a jar labeled college. It sat on the kitchen counter like a silent promise. I remember the winters most vividly. Our apartment was small and drafty, the windows rattling when the wind picked up. I'd bundle Ryan in blankets, sit beside him with a flashlight, and read him the same children's book again and again until his eyelids drooped. Sometimes I'd trace the outline of his face with my finger and wonder how something so small could give me so much strength. There were moments of quiet pride too. The day he learned to read on his own, his first school award, the time he hugged me in front of his friends and told me I was the strongest mom in the world. I lived for those moments. They were my paycheck, my oxygen. Back then, I truly believed that love, especially a mother's love, was enough to guarantee loyalty. That if you gave your whole heart to someone, they'd carry it gently forever. I built my world around that belief. I didn't know yet that even the purest love can be taken for granted. Years passed, and Ryan's visits began to change. At first, he'd come by every weekend. He'd sit on the couch, tell me about his job, laugh about old memories. But slowly, those visits became shorter, quieter, more distracted. His phone was always in his hand. His eyes were somewhere else, far beyond the walls of my little house. When he got married to Laura, I tried to be happy for him. She was polite in that careful, distant way that made me feel like a guest in my own family. Every word she spoke sounded like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. I could tell she didn't like my home, the mismatched dishes, the old sofa, the photos of Ryan as a boy still hanging in the hallway. She never said it outright, but her silence said plenty. Still, I kept our Friday dinners. Every Friday. I cooked. Every Friday. He came. Every Friday. He left early. That became our rhythm. Sometimes he'd compliment the meal without really tasting it. Sometimes he'd tap at his phone as I spoke, nodding at all the right moments, but hearing none of it. The pie always stayed half-eaten. The coffee grew cold before we reached the second cup. I told myself it was just life. That busy people drift. That his career, his wife, his new world needed his attention more than I did. But every time I watched his car pull out of the driveway, that small ache in my chest grew heavier. I stopped asking him to stay longer. I stopped calling first. Maybe part of me was afraid that if I pushed too hard, even these short, hollow visits would end. So I accepted the scraps of time he offered and convinced myself they were enough. I think that's when the distance truly began, not in his silence, but in mine. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The same kitchen. The same quiet hum of the refrigerator. The same man I once rocked to sleep only now. His voice carried a calm authority that didn't belong to a son. Ryan told me he wanted to help manage my money. He said it like a favor. With that steady, reasonable tone he used when convincing people he knew what was best. I remember watching his mouth move. His words sounding almost gentle, almost. Something, in the way he looked at me, made my stomach tighten. It wasn't concern. It was control wrapped in politeness. A few days later, he came back with a stack of papers. Official looking. Neatly clipped. Smelling faintly of printer, ink, and coffee. He spread them out on the table. Explained how this would make things simpler. Safer. He talked about protecting my future. About efficiency. About trust. He smiled the entire time. As if he were reading from a well-rehearsed script. I nodded, pretending to follow along. Until I noticed one page, the fine print. Lines of dense words that didn't match the easy tone in his voice. Words like, transfer of authority. Exclusive management rights. Full access. My fingers went cold as I traced them. My heart began to slow. Heavy and deliberate. As the truth took shape, I almost signed, out of habit, out of love, out of fear. But then I looked up and saw his eyes steady, expectant, calculating in a way I had never seen before. It wasn't a moment of anger. It was clarity, a curtain quietly lifting. I told him I'd think about it. My voice was calm, almost too calm. He hesitated, his smile flickering just enough for me to see what hid underneath. Something sharp. Something unfamiliar. When he left, the house felt different. The air thicker. The walls closer. I sat at that table for a long time, staring at those papers, realizing this wasn't about care or protection. It was about power. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The house was still and cold. The kind of silence that makes you notice every creak in the floorboards. I didn't even drink my coffee. I just got dressed, grabbed my purse, and drove straight to the bank. I told myself it was just to ease my mind, to double-check, to prove my unease wrong. The teller smiled politely as she pulled up my account. I remember her voice softening when she read the numbers. Something wasn't right. There were withdrawals I didn't make. Several of them. All in neat, round amounts. I stared at the screen as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something innocent. But they didn't. When I asked for the printed statements, my hands shook as I turned the pages. Each line felt heavier. More impossible. Then came the second blow: credit cards I never opened. Bills under my name for things I'd never bought. Assurance document. Even a small loan. All signed with my handwriting that wasn't mine. It was like looking into a mirror and seeing a stranger's reflection. For a long time, I just sat there in the car. The papers spread across the passenger seat. The late morning light flickering through the windshield. I thought of every time Ryan had offered to help with my bills. Every time I'd let him use my desk. My computer. The nights I went to bed early and woke up to find my mail moved. The faint smell of cologne in my office chair. The pieces fit together too perfectly. And that's when denial began to fade. He had been stealing from me. Not once. Not by accident, but over and over. Quietly. Deliberately. My son. My only son. It didn't feel like anger yet, just silence. A hollow space where love used to sit. I drove home without turning on the radio. I sat at my kitchen table again. The same place where he'd smiled just days before. The papers lay in front of me. The proof of everything I didn't want to believe. Betrayal doesn't happen in one moment. It builds quietly, transaction by transaction. Lie by lie, until you wake up and realize the person you trusted most was the one holding the knife. And that's when I decided it was time to stop being afraid. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the clock marking each second I'd lost to denial. There were no tears left, just a strange, cold steadiness in my chest. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I started small. I gathered everything: receipts, statements, emails, letters, every piece of paper that could speak when I no longer could. I made copies, labeled folders, and locked them away. The rustle of paper became my armor. Each click of the pen, each file I organized, felt like reclaiming a part of myself. A few days later, I met with Mr. Power Daniels, a retired lawyer who had helped a friend of mine years ago. His office smelled of old books and lemon polish. He listened quietly as I explained what had happened, no interruptions. Not beady. Just that patient, steady look that made me feel believed. He told me what steps to take, what to protect, how to ensure Ryan couldn't hurt me further. His words didn't sound like revenge. They sounded like freedom. When I left his office, I felt taller. Not stronger exactly, but grounded, like the earth had shifted back under my feet. At home, I opened a new bank account. Quietly, methodically, I changed my passwords, redirected my deposits, and moved what was left of my savings. Every keystroke felt like a breath of air after being underwater too long. That evening, Mrs. Graham from next door knocked on my door with her usual plate of cookies. I hadn't told anyone, but something in her kind old eyes made me pause. When I finally shared the truth, she didn't gasp or scold. She just took my hand and said, "Do what you need to do, dear. You've earned your peace." And that's what I did. Over the next week, my house turned into a quiet battlefield. Documents in neat piles, notes in careful handwriting, evidence sealed in envelopes. No shouting, no chows, just quiet preparation. I didn't know when Ryan would realize what I'd done, but when that moment came, I would be ready. Not angry, not broken, ready. Sometimes justice doesn't need noise. Sometimes it just needs patience. The knock came just after sunset. Sharp, repeated. The kind of sound that doesn't ask for permission. I knew before I opened the door that it was Ryan. A mother always knows when a storm is about to hit. He stood there on the porch, Laura beside him, her arms folded tight across her chest. His face was calm, but not the kind of calm that comes from peace. It was the kind that trembles underneath, waiting to break. I stepped aside and let them in. The house felt smaller the moment they entered, their presence filling the space with tension thick enough to taste. He started talking fast, accusing, defensive, all at once. Words like unfair and betrayal tumbled out, but I barely heard them. What struck me was the tone, the arrogance of someone who thought he still held the upper hand. He spoke about money, about reputation, about how I had embarrassed him. But behind every word, I could hear something else: fear. Laura didn't speak much. She just stood behind him, her lips tight, her eyes darting between us. I could tell she didn't come to defend me, but she didn't quite defend him either. Maybe even she could sense something had shifted. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't racing anymore. I listened until his voice cracked slightly, just a flicker, but enough. Enough to know he understood that his power over me was gone. When I finally spoke, my words were simple. I told him I knew everything, that I wasn't his victim anymore, that my love for him hadn't vanished. But my silence had. I remember his face hardening, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to find the mother who would back down again. But she wasn't there. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just said that I would no longer live under anyone's control. Not even his. Especially not his. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the ticking clock on the wall. Steady and indifferent. Then, slowly, I walked to the door and opened it. The air outside was cool against my face. I told them it was time to go. Ryan hesitated, his pride wrestling with the truth. But eventually, he stepped out. As the door closed behind them, I felt the quiet settle again, only this time. It wasn't loneliness. It was freedom. That was the night I stopped being afraid of losing him, and started choosing myself. After that night, everything moved quietly, but swiftly. Mr. Daniels helped me file the reports, organize the evidence, and make sure every document was airtight. There were no raised voices. No scenes in court, just signatures, dates, and the slow turning of justice. Ryan didn't take it well. He tried to spin the story, posting online about his unstable mother and how I was ruining his life. I read his words once and then closed my laptop. I didn't need to defend myself. Truth doesn't panic. Truth waits. The investigation spoke for me. Every withdrawal, every false signature, every forged document, it all told a story far louder than his words ever could. His lawyer must have seen it too, because within weeks, the tone changed. Ryan agreed to repay $17,000 and issue a formal confession. When I saw the statement he posted, admitting what he'd done, I didn't feel the victory I thought I would. Just a quiet achh. People shared it online. Some in outrage, others in pity. I stayed silent. I didn't want pity. I wanted peace. Justice. I've learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it comes softly, through steady steps, through patience, through the strength of not breaking when someone tries to take everything from you. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The weight I'd carried for months began to lift, not because he had fallen, but because I had finally stood my ground. It wasn't revenge. It was freedom. The mornings here are quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a blessing. My little house sits a few miles from the shore, where the wind smells faintly of salt and wildflowers. I wake early, make my coffee, and sit on the porch to watch the sun rise over the water. The light spills across the horizon like forgiveness. Sometimes I think about everything that happened. Not with anger, not with sorrow, but with understanding. I didn't win by destroying my son. I won by choosing myself for the first time in a very long time. Healing, I've learned, isn't about fixing what broke. It's about learning to live fully again. Even with the cracks. If my story reminded you of someone who forgot their worth, maybe this is your sign to remember it. To stand up gently, and begin again.